Well, I've been talking about progressive visions of God in this series, which began at the beginning of January and goes for a few more weeks yet. And what I've been doing is I've been reading some blog posts from the Patheos Progressive Christian Portal, which is online. And a number of bloggers wrote in response to a challenge to talk about God and how do you describe God. The blogger whose description of God I'm going to read a little bit from today is named Paul. And from his about page on his blog, he is around 30 years old. He's married with 3 children. He came out of college with a degree in journalism and was working as a journalist, and then decided to go to seminary. And he, I think, is still in seminary. The blog is titled Disoriented, Reoriented. And it has that name because he talks about how he grew up in a very conservative, evangelical, Christian faith family and tradition, church, and eventually found that that didn't work for him. And for a while he was completely out of church and out of religion, but then began to kind of think through and put together a new faith story or faith formation that worked for him that was more progressive, and eventually decided to go back to seminary so he could think some more about that. He says about himself, this is what he says: "I grew up more conservative than Rush Limbaugh, and I'm now more liberal than Barack Obama. I can't speak, from reading his blog, I can't speak about the nature of his former conservatism. A little bit he talks about that. I can, however, say with some certainty from reading his blog that he is not more liberal than Barack Obama. He is what I think he would describe, and what I would describe from reading his blog, as a progressive evangelical. He hasn't given up some of the faith claims of his evangelical tradition in terms of the way he talks about Jesus as the Son of God and the fallenness of humanity and Jesus dying to save humanity from its fallenness. And he says that clearly in his blog. But his thinking on a number of issues like the role of women and homosexuality and the inerrancy or accuracy of Scripture has evolved. And so in that way he's, I think, accurately labeled a progressive evangelical. So here's what he has to say in response to the question, how do progressives, Christians, talk about God? "It struck me lately that the best way to think of God is to compare him," that's another way his thinking hasn't changed. He's very much into the male language of God. "Struck me lately that the best way to think of God is to compare him to an elephant. Specifically, I think of God like the elephant in the old South Asian tale of the blind men who each grab hold of a piece of him and describe the animal they think they have. One has the trunk and thinks he's holding a snake. Another has an ear and thinks he's holding a fan, etc. Each of them is attempting to accurately describe what they know. And some do a better job than others, but none of them is exactly right. Indeed, being exactly right would have been impossible if they had never seen or felt the whole elephant before. Which is why I call God postmodern, and why it would serve the church well to stop running in fear from the notion of postmodernism. Perhaps no era in the history of the world better suits the God we worship than the one that openly and completely questions the ability for anyone to fully grasp and explain truth. In the end, we are all blind. We cannot know God because we cannot see him. More important, we cannot see him without the cultural assumptions and baggage we bring to the table. Not only is this true for us, it is true for every person who has ever lived, including those who described the God they knew and wrote about him in the ancient texts that we have collected, bound together, and called the Bible. The Bible, of course, is the story of God, more specifically the story of God's interactions with his people. And we cannot learn about him without studying what others have thought about him. It helps lift the curtain of our blindness a little. Maybe helps us grab a second or even a third piece of the indescribable elephant. The ancient Israelites thought they knew God. Their culture taught that God was a vengeful, violent warrior who did battle for them, demanded sacrifices to appease his anger, and required from them absolute loyalty no matter how seductive the wiles of the gods surrounding them. In that sense, Yahweh was no different than Ashdod or Baal. Yet they also had glimpses that Yahweh was much different than the other gods. While they were said to have created the world through violence and carnage, and that humans were the annoying products of accident whom the gods tolerated, the ancient Israelites had a different story, a hymn in which God creates the world on purpose, and after he's done, considers his creation very good. The ancient Israelites were blind. They described what they knew, but they couldn't escape their culture. They got some of it right, and they got a lot of it wrong. A few hundred years later, the prophets describe a different God than the one passed down through the oral history of the Israelite and Judaic monarchies. The God who cares, grieves, and loves is still there. But the prophets also tell the people God does not care about sacrifices or about worshiping him in the right way. He cares about justice and compassion. He cares about righteousness, but he views it through the lens of social justice. Men like Amos and Isaiah describe a set of priorities far different than those espoused through most of Israel's history. Their picture of God was a little more clear. But it was no less bound to culture. Bad things were still the result of God's hand moving against them. The exile needed an explanation, and the one for which they grasped, the only one available to their cultural assumptions, was divine punishment. To them, either God was dead or teaching them a lesson. They could only choose the latter. Fast forward another few hundred years, and God, who was progressively revealed more of himself to the blind children, has adopted and reveals himself completely, wrapping himself in flesh and coming to earth in human form. The incarnation is a stunning, counterintuitive move, completely antithetical to the theologies of the millennia preceding it, especially in light of God's decision to allow himself to die the cursed death of a criminal. As the Gospels make clear, even those who walked with Jesus every day were blind. In the physical presence of God every waking moment, they were no better than the man at Bethsaida, who after being touched by Jesus could still only see people who looked like trees walking around. Even in the light of Jesus himself, his followers could not see clearly. Yet they described what they could. But even in the light of Jesus, they were blind. As first-century Greco-Roman Jews, their cultural assumptions about the relationship of God to people and people to each other, radically transformed though they had been, remained impossible to escape. Perhaps no people have ever seen so much of the elephant at one time, yet not even Paul or the writers of the Gospels saw the whole thing. In the 1800 years or so since, the Church continues in its efforts to describe the elephant it cannot fully see. Modern concepts such as fairness, equality under the law, egalitarianism, and democracy have reshaped our view of God beyond what the authors of the New Testament could know. In many ways, this has illuminated the nature of God in tremendous ways. In others, it has led us into further darkness. Scientific discoveries in the last 200 years have changed anew the way we see God. The realization that he used a painstakingly slow process to create the universe, that humanity itself is the product of millions of years of evolution, that for some reason death is built into the structure of the world God created. All of these things change our view of God. Cultural movements like feminism and gay rights lead us to re-examine our assumptions about the God we too easily make in our own image, giving us the freedom to perhaps grab hold of a different area and see what the elephant feels like from somebody else's point of view. Because if studying the many voices and arguments about God enshrined in the Bible should teach us anything, it is to hold loosely to the God we think we see and be ready to acknowledge he, she, might be something else differently. At no point in the history of our dealings with God has humanity ever gotten the answer right. No one, not even those who saw God himself walk the hills of Palestine, has ever fully understood him. With the benefit of hindsight, we can see now that the ancient Israelites did not see. Through the radical pacifism and sacrifice of Jesus, we can understand how their view of God was limited by the violence of their culture around them. Through the teachings and actions of Christ, we can hold ourselves up to the mirror and see how every day our culture blinds us to just how big and awesome and awe-inspiring and impossible to understand God is. Even today, with all of our scientific accomplishment, cultural openness, and critical scholarship. Because we too are blind. Our culture, for all of its progress, is still violent. It still glorifies power and money. It still abuses the weak and the vulnerable. We've added doses of individual liberty and American exceptionalism, and we've created a God who doesn't look much different than the one described by the authors of Joshua and Judges, violent and judgmental, quick to draw the line between who's in and out, rewarding the rich and punishing the poor. We continue to describe a God who doesn't look much like Jesus. And I think I'll stop there. So, I chose this description, this blog post, because I think he makes two interesting observations about God, or what we can know about God. And the first is one that I've been touching about a little bit in each of the last couple weeks in different ways. It is that our understanding about God is always conditioned by our time and our culture. But he kind of adds the wrinkle, or at least wants to emphasize the fact that our understanding of God over time and as culture changes, God evolves. Ancient Israel chiefly thought of God as a warrior God. The prophets came along later and emphasized a God of justice and compassion. Jesus came along in his telling and gave us a fuller picture of what God is like. And then he goes on to say that the findings of science, as well as the kind of the march of history in Western culture with democracy and freedom and individual rights, and all of those have come along and have, over time, changed our picture of what God is all about. We take them all into account when we talk about God. So there's an evolutionary advance in humanity, and that influences our picture of God. And I should say that that's, when I'm reading him, that's part of what makes him a progressive evangelical, because the fact that he takes into account what has happened since the biblical times and talks about science in a positive way and talks about Western culture in terms of democracy and the things that have happened in Western culture, and sees those in a positive light, and that's part of the evolution of God, makes him a progressive evangelical. But, he says, we are still like the blind people grasping different parts of the elephant. We still only have the capacity to see or feel the part of God that our culture conditions us to see. And so he has this notion of the evolution and our evolutionary picture of God, but then he also introduces the idea of postmodernism. And I want to talk a little bit about that. I don't have the time to do justice to postmodernism. I think people have heard of that term. I think I've talked about it a few times before, but if you do any reading out there in terms of history or even modern science or philosophy or religion, postmodernism is talked about a lot. The post in postmodernism signifies, obviously, I think, that we're in the era after modernism. Historically, the age of modernism arises roughly with the beginning of the Enlightenment. So the modern era begins in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and comes into flower in that period of time. Modernism is noted as the era of scientific and historical and religious certainty. In terms of the philosophy of ideas, modernism is marked by the idea that there is a big T truth. There is truth. And it is possible to come to know that truth. There is scientific truth. And if you follow the scientific method, it will lead you to the truth about the universe and how it works. There is historical truth. Things happened, and that's the truth. And it's possible to use the historical method to get back and find exactly what happened in history. And there is religious truth. And the Bible and scriptures and doctrines and creeds help to spell out that truth, and if we follow them correctly, we will find and be able to see the truth about God and about Jesus and about religion. He talks about the elephant in his post. In modernism, there is an elephant. There is one elephant. And we may not be able to see the whole elephant, but there is one. It's out there. And with the proper method of observation and study, you can learn to see, touch, feel, and understand the elephant. And be certain that there's an elephant. The thing that needs to be said about modernism is that this is an entirely Western idea. The influence of Western culture on our world is obviously enormous. So it's a big idea. But it's still a Western cultural idea that there is one truth, one true elephant. In postmodernism, there is not just one elephant. It's not possible. There are multiple elephants. There is a native Indian's understanding of an elephant. There is a native African's understanding of an elephant. There is a white man's understanding of an elephant. There may be an elephant in the room, literally or metaphorically. But our ability to see and understand and describe that elephant is completely, totally conditioned by our culture. And we have no capacity to escape our cultural reality. And therefore, we will never see the same elephant, ever, as people who grow up in different cultures. I have mentioned before here Wade Davis's book, The Wayfinders. Davis is an anthropologist who has spent most of his life living deeply with other cultures and then comes out and writes about them. And in his book, Wayfinders, he has just amazing stories of how cultural bias, growing up in a particular culture, makes it impossible to see things that other cultures take for granted. I mean, he talks about being in cultures where they are looking at spirits, and he has no capacity to see them. But being in some of those same cultures, and they have absolutely no capacity to think about time as linear time, the way we do it. They can't think about it that way because they've never raised with it. And so time means nothing to them in the way Westerners think of time. Can't even think about it that way. He said about Western culture in that book, "We too are culturally myopic and often forget that we represent not the absolute wave of history, but merely a worldview. And that modernity, whether you identify it by monikers westernization, globalization, capitalism, democracy, free trade, is but an expression of our cultural values. It is not some objective force removed from the constraints of culture, and it is certainly not the true and only pulse of history." It is certainly not the true and only pulse of history. And in that sentence, you can hear the postmodern impulse in his statement, that there is not just one truth and one true history and one true way of knowing the world. And that's different than the modern era. In the modern era, an anthropologist would have gone out and spent time with the culture And while with that culture would have found it very interesting and would have reported back, would have assumed that that anthropologist was coming in from the superior culture, and that what he was observing were savages or something inferior, and quite possibly would have had a missionary with him with the purpose of helping to convert them eventually to the truth, the one truth that there is. And that's the difference between the modern era, which just assumed in the West that there is one culture that's valuable, true, and one history that goes with it, and one God that goes with it, and one way of thinking that goes with it. That's the modern era. So in postmodernism, there is no truth with a capital T. And there is no God with a capital G. If you are a progressive evangelical, or perhaps even a progressive Christian, you may hold to the conviction that there really is one true God out there. But if you follow postmodernism all the way down, the only God we can possibly know and talk about and describe is the one that our culture makes it possible for us to think about and describe and to know and to worship. Now that's a tough sell in many quarters. And there's been quite the backlash against postmodernism there's been a backlash from scientists and from historians and from many religious folks who really do not like the idea that there is not truth out there, that we can trust it's there, and we just have to find it. And I have to say that there's also what I would call a form of very shallow postmodernism. And shallow postmodernism takes the form of people who say, well, this is my truth, and that's the only thing that matters. And you can't know my truth, and so you can't tell me that I'm wrong. That's what I would describe as more of a shallow form of postmodernism. Because even within the postmodern movement, we can all agree that within the Western concept of the way we live, that there are norms that we can agree to about what is right and wrong and what justice is. And even though it's important and helpful to recognize that, for instance, the scientific method is shaped by our culture and makes sense in our culture, and therefore there are cultures where it makes no sense whatsoever. They don't understand it. Nevertheless, within our culture, we can trust it. And to say, for instance, that the science doesn't support vaccines, I mean, this is the kind of conversation you get going when you move into what I consider to be the shallow postmodernism that picks little pieces of science apart and says, well, my truth is different, and I'm going to follow my truth. So there's a danger there. And you get resistance to the notion of postmodernism from different quarters. To me, what postmodernism teaches me is a heavy dose of humility. To realize how much the world I live in has been shaped by a long history of culture. And that I really am not able to escape it, because it's what I grew up with. But then at the same time, and this is how our shrinking world has and what has really given rise to postmodernism, the recognition that there really are other cultures out there that see the whole universe and the world in completely different ways. And think about divine God, if they think about it at all, in ways that's completely different than the way we do. And you have a couple choices when you begin to realize that. And one is that you can just pretend it doesn't exist, or try and hold on to the sense that, well, the truth that I know, obviously, is the real truth. And those people are wrong. Or to bring a little humility to the world that we now live in, and to realize that there is really deep truth out there that's different than ours. And we probably can't really understand it completely because it's not the truth that we grow up in our culture. But if we are going to get along in our world, then it's pretty important that we acknowledge that other truth and those other cultures, and that we listen, and that we don't impose, and that we find, in whatever way we can, ways to work together. And that's what postmodernism brings, I think, is that sense of humility about what we really know in the world that we live in. So the God of the blogger, Paul, that God is an ever-evolving God. It's, from some perspectives, it's the notion of progressive revelation, that God has revealed himself or herself progressively over time. And from other quarters, it's just the sense that as our culture changes, that we cannot help but think about God different. And we don't think about God the same way as the ancient Israelis did, because we live in a different time and a different culture. And however we think about God, whether it's ancient or today, that our thinking about God is completely conditioned by the culture we live in. And we cannot escape that. We just can't possibly think about God in any way apart from the way we have been conditioned to think about God and talk about God in our culture. And that's postmodernism. So that's the God of Paul. Thank you for listening.